So thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Sarah Davis, and I'm an educator at the Illinois State Museum. And thank you for joining us for Illinois Mounds and their meaning. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Duane Esarey and Logan Pappenfort from the ISM-Dickson Mounds.
Hello, my name is Logan Pappenfort, and I'm joined with Dr. Duane Esarey of Dickson Mounds. And thank you for joining us today as we talk about mounds and their meaning.
Hi.
So I think first, Duane, you're breaking up.
I just thought I'd introduce myself. Duane Esarey. I'm the director at Dickson Mounds. Really different line. So.
All right. Well, while Duane figures out his internet issues, I'll go on ahead. So first off, what is a mound? A mound is a earthwork essentially that was created by ancient Native Americans. And so today, that's what we're going to be talking about, is going over what these earthworks are, their significance, and their importance moving forward. So in my native language, mound is Prikwakia. And so these mounds are vitally important because not only of their significance towards history and archaeology, these are sacred spaces for all Native people. And so what does a sacred space mean? So depending on the mound work that we are talking about, it would be no different than being present in a church or a mosque or a temple. And so with that in mind, these are very sacred spaces to all Native people and places of power. And when we're talking about these sacred spaces, we need to keep in mind the respect that is needed when we talk about them and are associated with them. However, mounds are also very significant on our landscape. And they're a piece of living history that, if you know where to look, you can see them everywhere. As you're driving down the roadways of Illinois, you might look out and see simple farmland, simple pastures, lots of corn, I'm sure. But when I look out across Illinois, I see sacred places everywhere, and places that have been long forgotten, as well as places that have unfortunately been lost and destroyed. So with this being said, mounds are also a extremely valuable, non-renewable cultural resource. And what I mean by that is that these mounds, these sacred sites, they connect us with our past in a way no other thing can. And in that way, they need to be respected as such. As we get further into the presentation, I hope you'll see some of the elements of how that can happen in the future and how it hasn't happened in the past. And how even the idea of these mounds has been questioned in the past, which moves me on to my next point. Myths and misconceptions about mounds. So from the ages of antiquity and the first contact with white settlers, these mounds have been ever present, and they've been at the forefront of the thoughts of, what are these? Who built these? Where did they come from? Which brings us to the myth of the mound builders culture. And so the origin of this myth is a little bit contentious, but it's that there had to be a group of people before the native tribes that constructed these mounds, because in very colonial ways of thinking, the native groups that were present were not deemed as capable of constructing these earthworks. And you hear all sorts of theories for mounds, ranging from giants, aliens, to the Welsh coming over and creating these mounds. And that led to essentially some firsthand destruction of these mounds in the vanishing Indian mythos. And we see that even going back as far as some of our founding fathers, such as Thomas Jefferson, digging into a mound to document these lost tribes, when the tribes with which they built these mounds, they're ever present. And we can see that just by looking at the historical record and how long mounds have been around. The earliest mound is from the Middle Archaic, or over 5,000 years ago. And we have records of mound burials as recently as when Dupratz was documenting the niches in the burial of Tattooed Serpent. So here we see we have a 5,000 plus year record of mound building all the way up to contact. And yet there's a misconception that there are somehow these ancient far removed people, when realistically it's a blink of an eye in the grand scheme of things. So moving on to, okay, we know native people built these mounds. How were they built? So the construction of the earthworks is something that it requires cooperation, extreme cooperation, which is, I'm happy to say, a trait that contemporary tribes have to this day. And so in this community effort, there was not only a tools being used, but there are also particular sediments which were selected by Native peoples in order for these constructions, not unlike many construction projects that happen today. Some of the tools which we see in the archaeological record which would have been used for this construction of mounds include shell hoes, basketry remnants, Mill Creek lithic hoes, some examples of which I have on this slide. And so using these tools and extreme cooperation, the Native people of the past could create these fantastic earthworks that we still see in this landscape today. And we also can see in the archaeological record the elements of basketry that most likely would have been used to move all this mass sediment to these sites. So we talked a little bit about how mounds were constructed, but let's talk about the morphology of mounds, because I'm sure, as many of you may have heard, there's different kinds of mounds: conical mounds, platform mounds, ridgetop mounds, even effigy mounds such as serpent mounds. So each of these distinct types of mound has a distinct purpose and was important into the cultural landscape of Native people. And so you generally see platform mounds near a village setting, and oftentimes with settlements on top of the mounds. And in conical mounds are oftentimes seen with burial context, because that is essentially another way in which these mounds were used. They are our native cemeteries. And that goes back to another reason they need to be respected and protected in such a clear way. So now that we know how a mound is constructed, what types of mounds there are, how do we know how old a mound is? So we do that in several different ways. One which is by pottery that has been found in context of that mound, because pottery type allows us to date based on stylistic differences. And so based on the stylistic difference, it gives us an idea of when that mound might have been constructed. In addition to that, we have radiocarbon and other types of dating, which can lead to us having a potential range of dates where these mounds would have been constructed based on any type of wood or other biodegradable material which may be inside. However, this just gives us a context and not a full range of when exactly that date is. And to tell a little bit more about that, I'll hand it over to Duane.
Thank you, Logan. So, you know, so there's lots of ways of dating mounds. Logan just mentioned a couple of the best known and most effective and commonly used ones, radiocarbon dating and sort of the diagnostic artifacts that are included in the mound. There's both of those have some shortcomings in the sense that pottery often is swept up with mounds, with the dirt that's being used to construct a mound, and can date from 100 or even 1,000, a couple of thousand years earlier. And so the ideal situation, I guess, in trying to date a culture as opposed to like an event, a specific mound or mound construction, is to get a lot of dates. And in recent years, we've gotten very good at this with what we call Bayesian treatments for the radiocarbon dates, and also radiocarbon technology itself has moved rapidly ahead, so that the margin of error in radiocarbon dating is getting smaller and smaller. So what you're seeing on the left there is a chart of the results of radiocarbon dating, in which a large number of radiocarbon dates are being looked at, and the variation with them is being analyzed by a Bayesian statistical method, and the sequence of the margin of error for that process for those dates is getting low. We sometimes now see margins of error of the first standard deviation of down to 10, 20 years, and all of which has helped us. In general, I've been in this about 40 years in this career, and I've seen us go from basically talking vaguely about centuries to talking realistically about quarter centuries or even 20-year periods. And so that really helps us a lot, you know, and we put that together with pottery styles and others. And we have some very sophisticated dating technologies that are still underway, and we're still learning more too. Another the options, I think, are still somewhat open for getting radiocarbon chronologies, not radiocarbon, dendrochronological chronologies in the Midwest still, and when you get large enough tree cross sections to spot significant climatic episodes, things like that. So we're learning a lot more, is I guess the bottom line. So let's go ahead to the next slide.
So, given what we've learned about mounds, it's important to obviously realize how important these earthworks are. And in saying that, what we see in the landscape today is only a very small fraction of what existed at one time. Countless ancestral mounds, village complexes, and cities have been destroyed in the last 200 years since contact. And this is primarily due to agricultural activities such as plowing and industrialization and urbanization. So these are non-renewable resources that are not being treated as such and have not been treated as such in the past. And the second a mound is removed from the landscape, it limits the capacity of tribal citizens to identify with this sacred spot and these places of power. And it also limits the ability for all of us to connect more authentically with our past. And so I can tell you that our other panelist, Duane Esarey, has some firsthand experience with some of the destruction that has been wrought to these earthworks in the past. Duane, you're still muted.
Thank you. So I guess the way I would put it is I've been in the field for about 45 years. And if I had to put one overarching theme on what has happened is you get very used to, or you never get used to, but I've seen a great deal of destruction of these resources in my career. There's some good news, there's some silver linings to that generally downward spiral, because as Logan said, these are non-renewable cultural resources that each one of them is unique, and as we lose them, we have less and less and less. There is a lot less mound destruction than there used to be for a number of reasons. Both legal protections and sensibilities have made it more and more likely that, say, a highway is going to route around a mine, around a mound, or a village area with mounds, or a village area in itself. The ability of the consultation process has only strengthened our ability, our protection of mounds, and but there's probably the best way to move forward and give an understanding of what is lost is to talk about, you know, the level of destruction that we see in these resources. So go ahead then to the next slide, I guess. Logan, did you want to talk about this one, or?
So absolutely. So this mound group, the Nettler Mounds, as well as the Bird Mound, which is an association with it, is actually 100 meters from where I currently live. So the power plant at the last slide is what replaced these mounds. And there was a complete and utter destruction of this mound group. And just to put in the frame of reference, these mounds have been here for thousands of years. And now that power plant that replaced them is no longer in operation. So we essentially destroyed a sacred site to me and my people for 20 years of operation. So for me, as a native person of native descent, that is something that cannot continue. And so, Duane, you've been present in Illinois archaeology for an extremely long time. Maybe you could illuminate a little bit of the ways in which this happens, and then some of the preservation that is attempted as a result of these actions.
Right. So on this slide with the Nettler Mounds, which is better known as the Havana Mounds, we first heard of them back in the 1880s. There are a few accounts of them, and there were really, as you can see from the one on the left, was known as Mound 9 at this. It was actually, the Riverside Park was a public park until it was turned over to the power plant. And actually 20 years is not quite right, though. These mounds were destroyed in 1945. So it was a little bit longer than that, but the power plant did serve for only about a half century and is now decommissioned. And as Logan said, the site's gone forever. The Illinois State Museum worked on salvaging this site when it was going to be totally destroyed by the power plant. And so we did learn some about it, but usually clear up through the 1960s, at least, excavations of sites that were to be destroyed were done very haphazardly. They were just sort of a run in front of the bulldozers and do what you can. And even as late as 1980, we were doing some sites like that where there was no protection whatsoever. And so we have come a long way, and it's gratifying. There's other. Go ahead to the next slide there, Logan. Can you get? We have a next. Oh, there it is. Okay. I want to talk about another site, because when I say these sites, I'm using local examples because these are the ones I know the best. But there was a mound and village complex, one of 8 such Mississippian town and mound complexes at what was called the Orndorff site near Rice Lake in Fulton County near Canton. And in 1972, it was clear that this was going to be destroyed by the coal companies, and there was no protection whatsoever. It was clear that it could just go ahead and be destroyed. And my first days in the field were as joining crews that were working feverishly year after year in the summers as volunteers to excavate this. And we cleared this entire area. You can see in the upper left of 2 large villages. There's 3 large villages in that map. And the entire town dated to about 1210, 1220 AD, and was totally destroyed and had been destroyed. The end of that village was that in 1220s or so was that it was attacked and burned down. Every single house was burned down, and then the people basically walked away. And so that village was in a kind of a Pompeii state of perfect preservation when we excavated in the 70s, but there was no way to stop the strip mines. So we put together a 9-year effort to get that excavated with very little money, very little funding. And we'll get back to that in a minute, but it's an example of kind of the massive level of destruction that went on in those days, and still occasionally can happen under the right circumstances. Next slide, please. Yeah, that Orndorff village excavated was about 16 acres of village site. Now, probably most of the people involved who've come to hear this talk know about Cahokia Mounds. Cahokia Mounds is a paramount site in Illinois, and it is a massive number of mounds and plaza arrangements, and sort of North America's first urban area. Started in the early 1000s and lasted for about 300 years, and just massive cultural expression. Ancient capital of the Midwest is one of the titles that we used to frequently refer to it. And so, if you've been to Cahokia, which is just opposite St. Louis on the floodplain near Collinsville, Illinois, it seems like a great success story, right? You go to the visitor center, and there's this extraordinary vista out onto the Grand Plaza of Cahokia Mounds. And if you visited many of the other Mississippian towns in the greater Southeast United States, most of those towns would fit lock, stock, and barrel inside the plaza at Cahokia, just to give you an idea of the scale. So it is incredible, and it is indeed an exemplary thing that Cahokia Mounds core area was preserved. But what you're not likely to see at Cahokia, or to understand in its great depth, is that Cahokia was just one of many large urban area sites of what we now refer to as Greater Cahokia, and that the entire bottomland around there was filled with mound sites and urban centers and roads between them. And so Cahokia itself was the center for that entire development. Let me get the next slide, Logan. So you can see the image on the left. You see Cahokia near the large horseshoe lake, and then going to the east of there is East St. Louis Mound Group, St. Louis Mound Group. To the north of Cahokia, Mitchell, another large mound group. To the east, 16 miles away out on the prairie, another large mound group called Emerald. And then to the south, Pulcher down along the Mississippi River. So we're talking truly expansive area, the entire Metro East area of the St. Louis general metropolitan area. Now, some of these mounds have been preserved, like to the right, is the Emerald Mound site near Lebanon, Illinois, large plaza and mound center sitting up on top of a bluff or a high summit. But others did not fare so well at all. And so like and most of them, many of them, actually not most, but many of them have a very different appearance today. Give me that next slide then. So going north from Cahokia, looking at the Mitchell site, when you want to go to look at one of the major outliers of the Mississippian metropolitan, the prehistoric metropolitan area, as it were, of the Cahokian urban center, you're going to see things, something that looks like this. I mean, this is the Mitchell site, which was directly hit by a 4-lane highway in the early 1960s and nearly totally destroyed. You see the long building to the upper right. There's a long building. Just to the left of that, there is a remaining mound, but it's only one of just a few. And if you could read the caption on your screen, it indicates that the destruction of this site proceeded from a long time ago up to the 1960s, and I think Logan probably has something to say about this, because there's some things going on at Mitchell right now that we're talking about.
Absolutely. So a little bit about my prior background is before I was curator of anthropology for Dickson Mounds, I worked as director of cultural preservation for the Peoria tribe. And so in my work there, we enacted to protect some of these sites in day-to-day basis. And so I-270, as Duane mentioned, goes right over the Mitchell site. So any altercation to I-270 has the potential, in this corridor at least, to damage the existing mounds that still have the bottom footprint. And so with that in mind, Federal Highway and Department of Transportation have to be very careful in how they expand highways or realign highways, and have to consult with all the associated tribes to do so. And it is through that collaboration that we can work together to come to mitigation efforts or avoidance of these sites.
So Mitchell was one of the main disasters that befell the what we call Greater Cahokia. Let's take a look at another mound center that was even much larger. The next slide there. So on the left is a map made in 1819 of what is called the St. Louis Mound Group. Sometimes you'll hear that one of the names of St. Louis is the Mound City, and it's a little bit unfortunate in the sense that what that means is the city of St. Louis developed right on top of the St. Louis Mound Group, which stood across the river from East St. Louis, obviously, but also Cahokia Mounds and the whole populated American bottom side of the floodplain of the Mississippi River at this point. So that map was made in 1819. Less than 20 years later, the map on the right was actually made by Robert E. Lee when he was with the Union Army as an engineer. Made a map of St. Louis, and you can see that the city was rapidly closing in on the mound group with some mounds out there on the right, and then the large mound further yet out to the right. And then the next slide shows only in 1852 the view of St. Louis from the east side, and you can see that the city had sprawled all the way out to the Great Mound, and that Great Mound was massive. It was incredible, and so the spread of St. Louis was, as you might expect, pretty much unstoppable. And the last fragment of the Great Mound then disappeared, and the city rolled on over it in 1859. So 1869. So 50 years from the Peel map of the beautiful Mississippian town to the erasure in the beginning of forgetting about one of the main sites of the mid-continent, and one of the supporting outlying urban centers of Cahokia Mounds Urban Center. Next slide. Across the river, a relatively similar sized village called East St. Louis Mounds, directly across the river from St. Louis on the low ground. And a similar story, nearly all eaten up by the city. The next slide shows what St. Louis Mound Groups looks like by about 100 years ago, or 120 years ago. Can you get the next slide? There it is. Okay. So the railroads, the stockyards, the city of East St. Louis rolled right over the entire St. Louis Mound Group. And so for most of my career, it was common knowledge to archaeologists that the site was totally destroyed. There was no visible remnants of it that we knew about until about 1990, when highway projects started poking holes into it and finding parts of it still intact. And then very recently, in the 2000s and early teens, we started one of the largest archaeological projects in North America as the interstates that were being put up for the new Mississippi River Bridge made a large swath across the stockyards north of the main body of the East St. Louis, and found extensive areas of the site were still intact underneath 3 to 5 feet of fill. And this is one of those good news stories that these sites, even when they're erased, they can be a little bit more durable than we would have think. You know, that they tend to be out of sight, but we should never assume that they're completely gone. Even St. Louis, we haven't ever succeeded in finding much of it, but there may be more around St. Louis than we know of. The next slide shows that in the excavations that happened for the Interstate 70 bridge approach for the Stan Musial Bridge north of downtown St. Louis, a huge community was excavated. We found 1,600 houses and 5,000 pit features, and of different time periods dating from around 900 AD to up into about 1200. And this is interesting because that part of the St. Louis Mound Group, the Cahokia Mounds Group, were much. They started at the same time as Cahokia, but they quit. The Cahokia Center itself lasted longer than any of its peripheral precincts and sacred areas. So it's really important to get this big sample, and it's very reassuring to know that a lot of that still is preserved, although it's worrisome because it always can be destroyed since it's very difficult to see it or know much about it. Next slide. So this is an image of the East St. Louis group sprawled alongside the Mississippi River near the mouth of Cahokia Creek, and then off to the right, miles away, the Cahokia Creek then goes close to the Cahokia Mounds itself. And so it's best to think of this as like a massive metro area population, not just Cahokia in isolation. As stupendous as Cahokia is, it's just the tip of the iceberg, as it were. Next slide.
So, given the immense amount of destruction that's gone on with all these mound groups, as Duane went over as what we were referring to as the shocking part of the presentation, when you realize the depth of what has truly been lost. What has come out of it? What has come out of it is these archaeological investigations as a result of mitigation and preservation efforts for these sites. And so while it's a consolation prize to some extent, it is valuable information that connects both Native people with their past and gives people a way to learn and be part of that landscape again, even though if it's to a smaller extent than if the mounds were still intact and these villages were still intact. And then, so I would like Duane to, if you could bring up a little bit about the Orendorff effort and essentially the generation of archaeologists that effort inspired.
Well, yeah, I can talk about that some. As I said, my first days, and I joined the Orendorff excavation salvage and the Orendorff, knowing that we weren't going to be able to save those massive villages knowing that we were losing one of the 8 Mississippian towns in the Illinois Valley, that we it was really important for us to work as hard as we could to give, and sometimes I talk about the efforts that we put into that and the way that, and the archaeologists essentially that it created. So the effort, only 22-year-olds and basically people from high school age on up through their late 20s could probably do this, but we work 70-hour weeks plus about 10 hours of 15 hours of labs in the evenings, 6 days a week, year after year, to get as much as we could of that site salvaged. And then sort of the whole project went to sleep for about 30 years. And so I, as an archaeologist, and a lot of archaeologists of my generation were trained at Orendorff or knew of Orendorff, and it gave us a kind of a new way of working at scale to save massive sites and see that we had to open acres and acres of these sites if they were going to be destroyed. We couldn't just dig highly controlled little test squares and investigate the layers of dirt. So like people think of archaeologists as having a great adeptness with trowels and toothpicks and look all day and hopefully, and then finally find something. That's not my experience in Illinois archaeology ever. I mean, the tools we preferred and the ones we needed to use to combat the level of destruction that was going on were bulldozers and pans that carried away, many cubic cubic yards of soil each time they passed through the site, and we opened whole communities. And so it was with a lot of gratitude that I was pleased to see this book come out in 2019, basically going back 40 years for me and the archaeologists all over the continent that got their start in those rough and tumble days when there wasn't legal protections. So it's pretty easy to get to the stage where you see that things are actually much better. And you know, and I really appreciate Logan's assessment of these books, that these are, as he said, a consolation prize for the real thing, but at the same time, they are our record of what we could learn under very bad and difficult circumstances, and the laws that protect the resources, especially mounds and burials, and have transformed the perspectives of some of those early days when there was so little choice about what we could do except scramble as best we could. And so Logan and I were talking this afternoon about sort of what these laws have been able to do, and I think he has some more comments about that in the coming slides.
Yeah, and so I think also as we progress forward in preservation, one big thing that's going to be paramount is collaboration. And so the importance of collaboration between archaeologists, researchers, and tribal partners is vital for us as we go forward in this new space where we can coincide and work together to protect these sites. And so when we're working together to protect these sites, much like the Departments of Transportation, Federal Highway do when they consult with tribes for Section 106, National Historic Preservation Act, that opens up opportunities of research collaboration between Indigenous archaeologists and Native researchers, as well as your more traditional archaeologists, anthropologists, and bioarchaeologists. And so by working together to develop ethical research methods to move forward, we can do a lot to move that needle and not only learn what tribal nations are interested in and can contribute to, but also keep moving forward the field of archaeology. And it also helps to do exactly what we're doing today, and that is to educate the public about how precious these earthworks are and how important it is that not only professionals and tribal partners work together to protect them, but also your average person. Your average person, the public, has, in my mind, a responsibility for future generations to protect these sites. And it's something that everyone should take tremendously seriously. And in protecting these sites, that we wouldn't even be having this conversation if it were not for many laws that have been enacted in the past 50 years. And so in the past 50 years, we've seen laws like the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106, which requires consultation of federal undertakings, which has given a lot of voice to tribal nations. You know, before these laws came into act, what would generally happen is those in removal states, such as Illinois, would not know what tribal nations were associated with their state. And as these laws became more commonplace, and especially the federal laws, citizens of those removal states started seeing more and more tribal citizens cooperating and coming back into our ancestral homeland. And so the real value, other than the tangible preservation that these laws provide, is it gives tribes agency to protect their own sites in ways that they could not before due to either lack of resources or lack of laws. And so, Duane, if you had anything to add to that. want to give you an opportunity to speak.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add to it, again, this is a long-term perspective, is that it's very gratifying, I'd say, for us, the laws and the implementation of the laws, the consultations that are necessitated by implementing the cultural resource management, the tribal historic preservation offices that we get to speak with, and the professionals on that side of the table that we get to learn. This has just been very gratifying addition to archaeology in the recent decades, and basically what it illustrates to me and many of the colleagues that I've worked with is that basically we're all headed the same way. We're all oriented towards the same goals, and we want to see the same outcomes. And this is exactly what it's about.
So in conclusion, I hope that you've taken away from this presentation, this talk, that, these mounds, these earthworks are significant resources for tribal nations as well as non-tribal citizens. And a real existent group of people created and constructed these earthworks for real reasons. It was not some imaginary giants or alien construction, and they didn't just appear. This was a concerted effort through cooperation of tribal nations. And it is also all of ours duty to protect these sites, as well as to learn how to ethically preserve these for the next generation. And so with that, I think we could probably go into the Q&A session for the talk, unless you have something else you'd like to add in finishing thoughts, Duane.
No, let's do it. Logan, why don't you pick a question, and I'm having trouble with my phone to see the questions, but if you'll read them out loud, pick one that you think we might be able to make up an answer for. And anyway, and go ahead and read it out loud, because I'm having trouble seeing them.
Okay. Oh, I was looking at the chat instead of the Q&A. My apologies.
Well, I got in here. Here's one that I like. Is there any estimate on how many mounds there used to be? That's not something we know, but I know that 130 years ago, the Bureau of American Ethnology at the Smithsonian set about trying to systematically find all the mounds. They found tens of thousands, obviously. They made maps of the Mississippi Valley and all of the mounds that they could find, and it's not a numerical estimate, but these things, I mean, we're talking about the grave sites and ceremonial sites of hundreds of generations. These things are these things, if you think of a landscape being occupied for hundreds of generations, there's going to be a lot.
Here's one that I think would be good to answer as well. How many tribal preservation officers are in Illinois? This question's by Jerry Paulson. Um, it's not really, it doesn't work that way as far as tribal preservation officers. Each tribe generally will have a tribal preservation office. And then is the duty of federal highway as well as Department of Transportation to reach out to those tribes in a government to government consultation, even if they're not located in Illinois. For example, the Peoria Tribe of Indians of Oklahoma is located in Oklahoma due to removal. So all of the tribes from Illinois have actually been removed and are consulting because of that removal in Illinois. So I hope that answers your question a little bit in that regard.
Here's one, commenting on the postcard caption of the final destruction of the big mound suggests the destruction of mounds has been willful and malicious. Has this been the case in your observation, or is it just carelessness and ignorance? I think like with a lot of places, that a lot of I'm going to go back to resources, although mounds are much more than a resource, but I'm going to go back to calling them resources because the analogy I want to make is that it's a very normal thing and has been a very normal and or at least typical thing of the last 200 years to think that resources are limitless, and that the long accumulation of taking just one more or to thinking that these things are here for our consumption has been common. And so willful, yes. I mean, willful in the sense that people often knowing what they were, sometimes what we call looters or pot hunters, or people digging up graves just for to take and have for collections, the artifacts. That's willful and malicious. The 1960s, even until we had the National Historic Preservation Act, it's easier to run massive highways through a site than around it. Yeah, that's willful. I mean, that's not perceiving the big picture of how valuable and the need to preserve these things was going on. So the national mood has steadily changed, and I'll bridge some of the other questions I saw going a little bit further with this, in that by the late 1980s, people were becoming more and more shocked at seeing some of the wholesale destruction, the willful destruction of these sites, especially mounds, being destroyed for no better reason than because people wanted to collect the artifacts. And so this has been a gratifying change in the field as well, is that a lot of the preservation laws that archaeologists lobbied for through the 80s and 90s have been put in place. Illinois has unmarked burial place laws since 1989 that have made a big difference, and just the whole sensibility that criminalizing this type of behavior instead of just it being somebody's choice whether they get to do that or not has moved us along nicely, I tell you, in terms of slowing a lot of this willful destruction down. So some of it is some of it is a matter of carelessness or lack of understanding, and some of it is more willful, has been more willful, so that it's a good feeling to come to the end of a career and see that so much change has taken place and in the right direction.
Here's another question from Mary Crane. And she asked if relics were salvaged from mounds destroyed and used to understand the use of the mound. That is actually exactly what happened. And one of the things that's happening now is that NAGPRA is allowing tribes to consult for control over these sacred items. And so when we talk about mitigation efforts, that is, something that absolutely has happened in the past. And these items were cataloged and with different institutions that now, with NAGPRA, any federal funding that touches that institution has an obligation to consult with tribal nations and do their attempt to affiliate that object and return it to the possession of those tribal nations.
Here's one I definitely want to address. Whoops, I lost it. How could it change? Okay, how can we explain the disconnect there seems to be between modern Native American tribal culture and the mound builders? What modern groups still practice mound building to bury their dead or as a center of worship? Well, Logan and I were talking some about this today. It's like one of the problems, and I view this as both an interpretive problem and a sort of an evidential problem, but it and also as a problem in a conceptual problem, that archaeologists, in talking about some of this stuff, tend to get very focused on levels of evidence and not say the really, really obvious stuff. So let me say the really, really obvious stuff. There's no disconnect in the sense that historically, the people, one thing I often say is the people of the Midwest that we knew that were living here in the Midwest in the up until the removal period started in the early 1800s are the descendants of the people that built the mounds across the continent. There's no question about that, and really we've known that for 125, 130 years. There hadn't been any real discussion about that. But what happens is that following I like some of these other questions, I see like what tribe built this or what tribe built that. It doesn't quite work that way. And and we've tried to start implementing laws like the Native American Graves Protection Act, the call for specifics has to like prove lineages has really morphed into a different process. I'd like Logan to talk about that a little bit, but I mean, how much of a loss would we be at to prove without written records who we're connected to, any of us are connected to 500 or 800 or 1,000 years ago. So that what's much more important is the question of tribal sovereignty, is basically the ability to exert voice and sensibilities of ownership in the broad sense and of these concerns and be the ones who make decisions. Logan, do you have more about that?
Yeah, so especially in regards to affiliation, in my mind, affiliation matters, but at the same time, what really matters is us as institutions doing the right thing. And the people of the Midwest are the people of the Midwest. The tribes of the Midwest are the descendants of the groups that created these mounds. That's without question. So the question of affiliation seems more designed to keep these items from the tribes in a way that is honestly disrespectful. And so more and more institutions are moving forward with doing what are called group consultation efforts. And in these group conservation efforts, all the tribes of that area can collaborate in order to make sure that these items and these ancestors are returned to where they need to be, which is their resting place.
Well, it looks like we're over. Do you, we can ask a moderator back in to help us finish this up.
Thank you both for a wonderful presentation. We have so many questions and unfortunately not enough time to answer them all. So thank you again to our presenters, Logan and Duane, and thank you everyone for attending tonight. We hope you enjoyed our program.